Fungus Among Us by Doomvroom. Bob Robinson took his nose out of the newspaper and glanced over at the turning doorknob from his recliner. The door opened before he could get out of his chair, so he did the next best thing and set the newspaper aside as he watched his girlfriend, Tracy Plinkett, enter the room. "Hey, hon, how was the pool?" he offered as his eyes trailed from her dark-haired head and down to her blue floral pattern decorated swimsuit. "The locker area smelled awful, but overall it was fun. I really wish I could have stayed longer, but work..." She let her words trail off before letting out a sigh. "You spend so much time in the water, I'm surprised you haven't turned into a lily pad." "Oh, now I'm a plant? Speaking of water, I need to shower and get ready for work." "Nah, you're a flower," Bob teased to Tracy as she left the room. A decent-sized portion of time had passed before a fully clothed, with the exception of socks, Tracy re-entered the front room, causing Bob to look up from the western he was watching. "Bob, my feet," Tracy stated in a melancholy voice as she sat next to him and placed her left foot on the recliner. Bob lifted the foot and examined it. A white callus had formed on the heel of it. Although a bit grossed out, Bob ran his hand across the callus in an effort to let Tracy know that it didn't change his opinion of her in the slightest. "It's just athlete's foot, hon. Probably a little fungus you picked up at the pool grounds. There's a ton of antibiotics that can clear that up," he said as he gently set her foot back down and reassuringly placed both his hands atop hers. "Thanks. I'll see you tonight?" she exclaimed with a smile and gave Bob a peck on the cheek before quickly ascending the stairs to retrieve her socks and shoes. With a quick descent of the stairs and a wave goodbye, she was out the front door. After a lengthy walk to the bus stop and a 20-minute bus ride, Tracy had arrived at work. Miss Plinkett worked as a cook at a famous all-you-can-eat buffet chain, Clanking Plates, an aptly named buffet chain if there ever was one. The joke was that people would be clanking their plates against the table in a hurry to get home. The young lady hustled into the kitchen and began her 8-hour shift in earnest. She handled everything from lettuce to steak. She truly was a busybody. As her shift progressed, she began to notice a white substance that was hardening on the top of her hands. Despite her best effort, the bathroom sink water, soap, and sanitizer had no effect on it. She thought back to earlier in the day and realized that it looked like her freshly acquired athlete's foot. She went into a stall, sat down, and lifted up her left pant leg, so as to undo a shoe and examine her foot for comparison. When she spotted that her leg was crusting with white, she poked it with her left index finger to discover that the crust was hard as a shell. A flurry of tears left her eyes as she worried about her beauty being permanently ruined. Tracy's depression session was interrupted by screaming from the restaurant dining room. After she had properly realigned her clothes, she cautiously exited the bathroom only to see people screaming, families crying, and a host of deceased people with the same white leaking out of their mouths as was crusted on her body. As her eyes scanned further with great hesitance and terror, she saw that a large portion of the food on the people's plates in the buffet had turned white and was coated with the same calloused shell that she and the deceased consumers had. After a few moments of shock, Tracy brought her eyes back down to her right hand and realized that the unwelcome anomaly had begun to spread up her arm. Try as she might, she was unable to peel off the shell with her fingernails. Whether out of hysterics or a fear-driven sense of logic, one cannot say, but Tracy headed to the kitchen, grabbed a steak knife, and stabbed it into the barrier that was forming around her arm. She dug the knife in until it wouldn't advance any further due to the fungus's hardness. The white crust responded to the intrusion by oozing and spraying crimson into Tracy's face. The smell confirmed her fears. The liquid was blood, most likely hers. The entirety of her right forearm was now covered with the mysterious white, even the bloody indentation where the knife had punctured and the knife itself. In a bit of desperation, the chef walked over to the blender with tears streaming down her face. Her right arm had to come off, lest she die. She slowly brought her left index finger to the blend button. while she balled her right hand into a fist and stuck it into the blender. Her mind raced as it punctured her arm, turning into a waterfall of gore and chunks as the blender spun around and around. Tracy was unable to commit herself to the act and removed her arm from the blender and brought her finger away from the buttons. Drunk on fear, frustration, and the need to live, she staggered over to the fryers and dove her consumed forearm into the grease with a blood-curdling scream. She lifted her, now yellow-crusted, arm out of the 375-degree oil with a wail and placed it on a nearby cutting board as she brandished a cleaver from a nearby knife rack. The shell had been considerably softened, she would have noted, had she not been washed in waves of pain and blood. And that had just been the first swing, which was barely enough to loosen the arm. 5 swings and a lot of hesitation in between each later, and she was down a forearm. Her balance became the equivalent of one that had consumed too much alcohol, as dizziness overtook her. The poor woman practically fell towards the stove and stuck the bloody remnant of her arm into the open flame, causing the wound to cauterize. Tracy fell to the ground soon afterward. Unfortunately for her, the job was half done, as she still had a fungus-caked leg. Bob walked into clanking plates with the widest and stupidest of grins on his face. He was going to treat himself to a nice buffet and visit his girlfriend at her job at the same time. Bob doubted that many people could claim that. Bob's expression changed to its polar opposite on the turn of a dime. One might find it comical in how quick it had changed if not for the circumstances. Before dear old Bob sat, lay, and stood a great many people who were all encased in a white substance. More unsettling than that for Bob was the sight of his girlfriend crawling out of the kitchen and into the dining room with one arm and some change for another. The caring boyfriend ran over to Tracy, leaving a trail of tears as he did so. What happened? He managed in between sobbing breaths as he reached out to help Plinkett to her feet. Don't touch me or I'll get you too, she cautioned in between gasps of pain and with great effort. Tracy. I need you to cut off my leg. Hold on, I'll get an ambulance. No time. I need it done now or I'm going to die. Bob sunk his head down towards the ground, half expecting it to sink in between his shoulders, and disappeared into the kitchen. A couple moments passed before he returned with the sharpest of knives that he could find, a butcher's knife. He set the knife on the floor and cradled Tracy's head with his free arm as he pulled up one of her pant legs and glimpsed into her blue eyes. I love you, he said as he continued to roll up the pant leg. I know. The pant leg reached the point to where it wouldn't roll up, a little bit past the knee, so he went to take off her pants in an attempt to locate the point where he needed to cut. However, as he pulled her shirt out of her pants, he saw that her stomach had crusted over. The white abnormality had traveled up her foot and to her stomach, maybe even further than that. Regardless, Bob realized how pointless it all was, and sat there cradling the love of his life. I was too late. I'm sorry, he sobbed. Tracy tried her best to respond with a smile, but instead produced a pained gasp. Bob started to say something in reply, but then thought back to earlier in the day when he had touched her infected foot, and then her now missing hand. The man slowly brought his hands to his face and stared at the small callous spot on it. Bob Robinson sat in silence as he recalled taking a trip to the supermarket and handling food with that hand. Food he didn't buy and was still sitting at the market, awaiting purchase. The Hissing. Patrick Stockman pocketed his sunglasses into one of his black suit's pockets as he walked into the Dowager Memorial Hospital. Stockman glanced around, staring at the various nurses walking around the hospital until he was able to decide on one. Hello, do you know where I can find Steve Greenwald? The dark-haired nurse pointed down the hallway. He's 2 rooms down and to the right. Thank you. Patrick followed the nurse's directions and came upon a small room that didn't contain much more than a hospital bed, a privacy curtain, and a couple of machines that kept the man alive. Stockman looked down at the man. He certainly matched the picture of Steve Grenwald he had been shown earlier, although he was worse for wear. Stockman closed the privacy curtain, walked over to the window and pulled down the shades as the man in the bed slept. As Stockman was moving a chair towards the bed, it made a scraping sound against the floor which woke the room's other occupant. The occupant of the hospital bed jolted upright when he saw Patrick Stockman. "Who are you?" "I'm Agent Stockman, FBI," he said as he reached into his suit pocket and brandished his FBI badge. "What do you want of me?" "I want to hear your story, Mr. Grimwald. You ought to be real good at telling stories considering you write for the Moonlight Report." "All right. 2 months ago I bought a laptop off Craigslist. It was already a few years old by the time I had purchased it. I can't recall the brand, but I think it was Acer. It's a lot more bulky than the laptops they make nowadays." "So if you bought it off Craigslist, then you would have met the seller. Where'd you meet?"
We met up at a Walmart parking lot and did the exchange there, security and all that."
"This is very important, Mr. Grinwald. Describe the seller to me to the best of your ability."
"The man who sold me the laptop was Caucasian, bald and bearded. The beard was something that you'd expect a stereotypical lumberjack to have."
"I need more to work with than that. What about his height and his weight?"
"He was tall and heavy, at least 6.5 feet and 240 pounds. I felt intimidated by him. Had we not been meeting in a well-lit parking lot during the day, I wouldn't have stopped and traded with him, although he was polite and cordial. His voice sounded off and constantly changed."
"Sounds like quite the weirdo. Tell me, why would you still follow through with the trade when dealing with a weirdo like that?"
"It isn't like I wanted to, but I was pretty desperate for the laptop because I had a story to write about bad oil spill which would necessitate some travel. Oh, he also wore overalls. I paid him the $500, prayed there wasn't CP on the laptop. That's how strange the man came off as, and went home."
Steve Grimwald paused, his mouth hung agape and his eyes began to shut on their own accord. Patrick snapped his fingers near Steve's face and placed his hand on his right shoulder. "Come on, Steve, stay with me. You got a story that needs to be told."
"Where was I?"
Grimwald asked weakly. "You just finished describing the man who sold you the laptop and made it home."
"Oh. I got home and charged it. After it finished charging, I turned it on and began typing. It was during that first session that I noticed a strange hissing sound almost every time I struck a key. I brushed it off and figured it must have been the computer working extra hard to keep cool."
The dark-haired nurse from earlier opened the privacy curtain, interrupting the story, and peered in.
"Sorry to interrupt, I just need to make sure that Steve was doing okay."
"Mr. Grimwald's doing fine. He's getting a tad bit sleepy, though, so I'm going to bow out pretty soon. I just want to finish listening to his story first, and I'll be on my way, miss," responded Patrick in his most charming voice.
"Everything's fine, Maggie,"
replied Steve Grimwald. Maggie nodded, apologizing for the intrusion, and shut the privacy curtain, which left the two men alone again. "Please continue, Mr. Grimwald."
"As I said before, my laptop got to where it would overheat all the time. Things steadily escalated to the point where I was saving my work every couple of minutes, and toward the middle of the second month, I resolved to use my next payday to buy a new laptop."
Grenwald began to cough. Blood snuck out with the coughs and wound up on his bed sheets. Patrick Stockman reached into his suit and pulled out a handkerchief, which he used to wipe the blood from Grenwald's mouth and then his bed sheets. "You're doing good, Steve. We're almost there. Hang tight," Patrick Stockman stated as he ducked out of the room. He returned a moment later with a cup of water in hand and handed it to Steve. He waited patiently as the sickly man drank the entire cup.
"Thanks."
"Sure thing. You can pay me back by finishing your story."
"Right. I was nearing completion of my article on the oil spill when disaster struck. The hissing grew louder than it had ever been before, and it sounded like it was coming from my left.
Steve Grenwald froze up, and tears began to flow from his eyes. He was clearly traumatized. Patrick Stockman stood up and put a reassuring hand on Steve's shoulder. There. You've handled yourself pretty well, Steve. Please, try to keep going.
I looked over to the left of my laptop just in time to see a small black snake lunge and sink its fangs into my left hand. The hand I was typing with at the time.
You'd been living in your laptop the entire time?
Yes. I had a snake living inside my laptop. I don't recall much after that. I barely remember fishing my cell phone from my pocket and calling an ambulance. I was hallucinating pretty bad by the time I was in the emergency room.
Let me guess, the species snake was an undiscovered one, and because of that you weren't able to receive antivenom.
Yes. Cost me a lot.
Steve Grenwald paused, and lifted his left arm from underneath the bedsheets, revealing a stump where his left hand had been.
Antibiotics only go so far when dealing with necrotic venom,
he remarked while shaking his head.
It could have been worse. It could have been my dominant hand. The doctors told me that I likely crawled in there to keep warm, as snakes like to do that. Sometimes I wonder if that man had put the snake in there.
That's what we believe to be the case, Mr. Grimwald. The individual you describe matches that of a known bioterrorist who's been modifying wildlife and releasing it to the United States ecosystem in an effort to destroy it. Thank you for your help.
Sure.
Steve Grenwald paused. His eyes started to shut against his own will, and blood began to pour from his nose. Agent Stockman pulled out a handkerchief and used it to wipe blood from Grenwald's nose, but more blood shot out of it. Stockman threw open the privacy curtain and began to shout for a nurse. He didn't stick around long enough to see the end result, of which he knew all too well. Familiarity. An old man walked onto the doorstep and rang the doorbell. A man with brown eyes, black hair, and an age that ranged from mid-30s to early 40s answered the door. The man and the old man walked a ways before arriving at a slab of cement with 4 columns jutting from it. A word was not spoken until they arrived.
I appreciate the help. Been trying to finish this for a week,
spoke the old man. The younger man turned to meet the gaze of the old man's dimming blue eyes.
Sure, maybe this will help me get my mind off my daughter. No, right. How long's she been missing? 7 days. Shame. Maybe she'll show up soon.
It was after this conversation had concluded that the younger man noticed a pungent odor that seemed to be coming from the cement slab.
What's that smell? Strong and nasty, isn't it? Cement makes it quite a smell. Believe I used a bit too much. Smell should disappear in time,
he replied casually. The 2 men worked without exchanging any more words. They parted ways at dusk, and they would meet in the same fashion and follow the same routine until the shed was finished 4 days later. Upon the shed's completion, the 2 went to the old man's house for dinner. The young man sat at the mahogany table as instructed by the old man, and waited patiently as the old man fired up the stove and fetched him a drink. "What's for dinner, anyway?" asked the younger man.
"Something very special,"
he replied, emphasizing the word special. The man took a drink of his root beer. It tasted out of date, but he kept on drinking due to his thirst, thinking about his daughter all the while. The old man walked back into the dining room and found the younger man passed out. He smiled. The basement door opened and the light shone in for the first time all day. The old man placed a plate at the top of the stairs and looked down at the 8-year-old girl at the bottom.
"I miss Daddy,"
she said softly from the bottom of the basement.
"He might be closer than you think,"
replied the old man with a smile and a quick glance towards the plate. The girl cautiously ascended the steps and grabbed the plate. The old man watched with fascination as the girl dove into her meal face first. He was taking care of her now, but hopefully she would come to take care of him when he progressed to the point of not being able to function by himself. He'd always wanted a daughter, and now he had one. After the girl had finished her meal, she handed the plate back to him.
"Do you know what that was, sweetie?"
he asked, knowing full well that she did not.
"No." "That was your old daddy. I did that to get rid of him so I could be your daddy. I decided to get rid of him in a way that I'd know he'd always be with you."
The little girl began to sob as she came to realize the gravity of what had transpired. The old man shut the basement door and locked it, leaving her alone in the dark.